Hey guys, this week's reading is going to be about civil rights and equal rights in Texas. Okay, before we begin the article, let's scroll down and look at the questions that we're going to need to answer after we read the article. Question number 1 says, which Supreme Court ruling declared that separate schools are not equal, forcing schools across the United States to integrate? Notice I put a hint of where in the article to look. You would look in paragraph 2 of African Americans Challenge Segregation, and you will see that at the very top. Number 2 says, what type of protest did Martin Luther King Jr. urge African Americans to utilize when fighting against discrimination? Number 3, what was the overall goal of freedom rides? Number 4, Lyndon B. Johnson pushed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 through Congress, making literacy tests illegal. What impact did this have on politics in Texas? Number 5, what changes did Texas women see in the decade following the 1977 National Women's Conference held in Houston? So let's begin reading. African Americans challenge segregation. In the 1940s, African Americans began to challenge unfair laws. 2 challenges started in Texas. African American Lonnie Smith filed a lawsuit or a legal action in which a person charges that someone has injured him or her in some way against the Democrats' white primary. In 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court said, in Smith versus Allwright, that African Americans had to be allowed to vote in the primary. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that separate schools are not equal. The local schools in the country had to integrate to include people of all races. African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, led by Martin Luther King Jr., boycotted, which is to refuse to buy or use particular goods or services as a form of protest, city buses to protest discrimination. The year-long boycott led the U.S. Supreme Court to declare segregated buses unconstitutional. King urged African Americans to adopt nonviolent protest, a form of protest that does not include any violence, such as marches and boycotts, in the fight for equal rights. Texan James L. Farmer Jr. founded the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, to win entry to public facilities for African Americans. This group used tactics of nonviolence protests such as sit-ins. A sit-in is a form of protest in which activists sit down inside or in front of a business to interfere with normal work, to protest segregation. Activists took seats in white sections of segregated lunch counters and refused to leave unless they were served. In 1960, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was illegal on buses that traveled between states. It also outlawed segregation at bus stations where these buses stopped. Farmer knew that this ruling was not being followed in the South. In 1961, he organized freedom rides, an integrated bus ride that went through segregated areas to draw attention to civil rights. In these protests, whites and African Americans traveled on interstate buses into the South. The plan was to break state segregation laws so that the U.S. government would have to enforce the court's decision. President Lyndon B. Johnson, a Texan, pushed 2 major civil rights laws through Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and national origin. After the passage of this law, integration began to move at a much faster pace. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 made literacy tests, a test to show whether or not a person can read or write, illegal. If necessary, federal officials would take over voter registration. After the Voting Rights Act passed, the number of African American voters in Texas increased. White politicians campaigned for their support. Many African Americans were elected to local and state offices. Mexican Americans seek fair treatment. In 1948, Dr. Hector P. Garcia formed the American GI Forum of Texas to fight for equal rights for Mexican Americans in the courts. It also registered them as voters and helped migrant workers. From 1978 to 1982, the number of Mexican American voters increased by 41%. They gained several local, state, and federal offices. There were key firsts for Mexican Americans in Texas. Raymond Tellis was the first to be elected mayor of a major U.S. city, El Paso. He was also the first to serve as a U.S. ambassador. Henry B. Gonzalez was the first to be elected to the U.S. Congress from Texas. Raul A. Gonzalez Jr. was the first to serve on the Texas Supreme Court. Women seek equal rights. Change was slow for women. Not until 1954 did women serve on juries in Texas. In the 1960s, the National Organization for Women, or NOW, set up groups in Texas to work for equal rights. In 1971, supporters formed the Texas Women's Political Caucus. This group helped women become active in politics. In November 1972, the legislature passed the Texas Equal Rights Amendment, and voters approved it. It gave Texas women the same legal rights as men. In 1977, the National Women's Conference was held in Houston. Its goal was to develop a national plan to increase opportunities for American women. Based on its work, President Jimmy Carter set up the National Advisory Committee for Women in 1978. The committee advised him on how to achieve equality for women. In 1950, about 27% of Texas women held jobs. By the 1980s, more than 56% did. Many women began careers in fields that had been closed to them, such as law and medicine. Women also gained public office. Many served on school boards, on city councils, and in the state legislature. By the early 1980s, women had won more than 690 public offices in Texas. So guys, remember to look through and look at my hints. So for this first question, again, which Supreme Court ruling declared that separate schools are not equal, forcing schools across the United States to integrate? So if you are looking in the second paragraph of African Americans Challenge Segregation, you're going to find that section, African Americans Challenge Segregation, and you'll look in the second paragraph here to find the Supreme Court ruling. Hey guys, let me know if you have any questions. You can leave a private comment to me or Coach Wagner, and we are happy to help you. Thanks guys. I hope you'll have a good rest of your week. Bye.